The fabric of time is often perceived as a consistent, unbroken stream. Yet there is no shortage of first-hand accounts which suggest that time may not be as linear as we typically experience it. Delve into 3 more true accounts of the time slip phenomena, and let us probe the undiscovered workings of time. Accompany George as he finds himself wandering into a bygone era on a street he knows all too well. Follow Jane as she faces haunting images of a farmhouse and boy out of time. And join Alexandra as she confronts a mysterious locomotive from an age-long past. Victorian-era visions. George Neville was an avid motorcycle enthusiast in his youth. During the early 1980s, he lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood and would often spend time tinkering with and repairing motorcycles in his grandfather's garage across the street. The town had undergone significant changes over the prior 2 decades. The old gas lamps that used to line the streets had all been removed and replaced with electric lights. The main road was widened and repaved, and a new bus shelter had been constructed on the corner. George's grandfather's garage, however, remained mostly unchanged since it had first been built decades earlier. One sunny afternoon, George decided to carry out some repairs on an old off-road motorcycle he had acquired. He carefully picked up his toolbox and the parts he needed and headed out the front door. After checking for traffic, he crossed the busy main road and made his way into the side street where his grandfather's garage was located. As George strolled down the sidewalk, he suddenly experienced a strange, pulsating sensation in his eyes, almost like a flashing light. He squinted and shook his head, but the flickering persisted. When he was finally able to focus his vision, he gasped in astonishment. Somehow the entire scenery around him had transformed. The paved road was now a dusty dirt path, flanked by weathered wooden fences overgrown with ivy. The electric street lamps had vanished, replaced by old gas lanterns atop wrought iron poles. The houses all had a vintage look, with faded paint and shingled rooftops. And strange carriages were parked along the curbs. George froze in his tracks, blinking rapidly in disbelief. He noticed a few people up ahead, dressed in peculiar Victorian-style clothing. A bearded man in a bowler hat stood in his garden, puffing smoke from a long tobacco pipe. He caught sight of George staring and whispered something to his wife, who was snipping roses from a bush. She peered over with a puzzled expression. George's eyes darted around the unfamiliar setting. Where his grandfather's garage should have been was just an empty stretch of shrubbery. His heart pounded as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Then once again, the flickering sensation returned to his eyes. He clenched them shut until it passed. When he opened them, everything was back to normal. The houses, the electric lights, the paved road. It was 1983 again. Shaken, George hurried the rest of the way to the garage, all the while looking over his shoulder, but the strange vision did not return. He tinkered on his motorcycle through the afternoon, his mind lingering on what had happened. Had he imagined it all? Hallucinated? Time-traveled? None of the logical explanations made sense. After that day, George found himself frequently glancing down that street whenever he passed by, half expecting to see the old gas lamps and Victorian characters reappear. But the experience never repeated itself. In the following months and years, as impossible as it seemed, the event gradually faded from his memory like a peculiar dream. He would only recall snippets of it decades later, when similar unexplainable events were reported in the news. Had he really somehow glimpsed into the past for those brief minutes? George could never be fully certain, but the vivid images remained seared into his mind. an untimely detour. Jane Thompson considers herself an avid hiker and explorer. Living in the countryside outside Leeds, West Yorkshire, England, she frequently sets out on long walks with her 2 dogs, wandering for hours through forests, fields, and farmlands. Despite having no formal navigation training, Jane prides herself on never getting lost, thanks to her keen sense of direction. One sunny August day in 2013, Jane noticed a signpost for a public footpath near the Leeds Bradford Airport and decided to follow it. The trail wound through the countryside, sloping downhill towards a large old farmhouse nestled in a valley. As Jane descended, she spotted the footpath leading directly through the farm's garden area. Not wanting her dogs to trespass or damage any flowers, she quickly bent down to attach their leashes. As she was clipping them on, Jane suddenly felt an uncanny sensation of being watched. She paused and stood up straight, scanning her surroundings. There didn't appear to be anyone else around. Instinctively, Jane's gaze was drawn upwards towards the farmhouse. In the top left window, she spotted a young boy peering out. He looked about 9 or 10 years old, sitting sideways on a window bench with his knees tucked up against his chest. His hands were clasped tightly around his legs as he stared blankly out the window. Something about the boy immediately unsettled Jane and gave her chills. His clothing looked dated and peculiar. Grey knee socks, white collared shirt, and a tank-top-style sweater. His hair was trimmed into a neat bowl-cut style that had not been popular for decades. As Jane studied the boy, an overwhelming feeling of melancholy emanated from him. Despite the warm, sunny day, she suddenly felt cold and uneasy. She hurried the dogs along, moving briskly up the footpath past the farm. But she could not shake the image of the boy's sad eyes gazing listlessly out the window. When Jane arrived home later that day, she told her husband about the strange encounter. He was skeptical, but agreed to accompany her on the walk the following morning. As they approached the farmhouse, Jane tensed up apprehensively. She looked towards the window where she had seen the boy, but instead saw only her own faint reflection looking back in the glass. She noticed that the farmhouse now appeared freshly painted and remodeled, unlike the worn-down version she recalled from the previous day. The unkempt garden was neatly landscaped, and the long gravel driveway was lined with an assortment of newer model cars. Jane was perplexed, but kept her thoughts to herself as they continued their hike. She considered herself a rational person, but the vivid memory of that melancholy little boy continued to lurk in the recesses of her mind. Had it been some kind of apparition? A peek into the past? There was no reasonable explanation she could conceive of. In the following weeks, Jane found herself deliberately avoiding walks past that farmhouse. The logical part of her brain rejected the idea of ghosts or time travel. Yet no matter how she tried to dismiss it, some instinctive inner voice told her she had witnessed something beyond understanding, if only for the briefest of moments. She would never forget those haunting eyes, gazing out from another era. The experience had opened her mind to possibilities beyond the mundane reality of everyday existence. The LiL Locomotive. It was the summer of 1995, and Alexandra Schmidt was thoroughly enjoying exploring the German countryside near her home. One evening, at around 5 p.m., Alexandra decided to take a scenic drive along some rural back roads as the day cooled down into twilight. As she drove down an isolated lane, she approached a railway crossing that passed over the tracks. An old wooden sign advised drivers to slow down and check for approaching trains before proceeding over the rails. Alexandra decelerated and scanned both directions down the tracks. Suddenly, she slammed on her brakes as an enormous steam locomotive came chugging towards the crossing. Billowing clouds of smoke and steam engulfed the vehicle as the train slowly roared past, moving no faster than 5 miles per hour. Stunned, Alexandra shifted into park and stepped out of the car to get a better look. The locomotive was a stark black, with no discernible markings, just a massive engine puffing and churning down the tracks. There were no passenger cars attached, only the locomotive barreling down the line. Alexandra stood transfixed as the train vanished into the distance. She had never seen a steam engine in operation before, especially not one as monstrously large and loud as this one. After the train passed, she peered down the straight stretch of track, but saw no trace of it. Perplexed, she got back into her car and continued home. When Alexandra asked her friends if they had known of any steam trains operating in the area, they all gave her puzzled looks and insisted there were only modern diesel engines that ran on those lines. Alexandra decided to inquire about it at the train station in town. However, the station master assured her that it would be impossible for a vintage steam locomotive to run on any local tracks unscheduled and unmarked. Baffled and a bit unsettled by her experience, Alexandra wondered if she had imagined the whole thing or hallucinated. But the memory of the metallic screeching, the billowing smoke stinging her eyes, and the quaking ground beneath her feet as the locomotive passed were unmistakably vivid. She knew in her heart that she had witnessed something unexplainable yet indisputable out there at the crossing. In the following years, Alexandra would occasionally read news reports about ghost trains and time slips where witnesses claimed to see undesignated and antiquated steam engines barreling down remote tracks. Their stories always reminded her vividly of that summer evening in 1995. While she still had no rational explanation for what she saw, she knew that for a brief moment, she had glimpsed into a different era. It was an experience she would never forget,